Hi everyone, great to see so many people joining us this evening. We're just waiting to get everyone into the webinar, and we will begin as soon as possible. Hi everyone. Just waiting for everyone to join before we start the webinar. Lots of people joining us this evening. Hi everyone. Just waiting to get everyone in before we start. Lots of people introducing themselves.
Nice.
Hi everyone. Just waiting to get everyone in before we start. Wow, lots of people joining us this evening from all over. Amazing. Okay. I think we've still got people joining. Great to see so many people joining us this evening. Okay, we've got quite a lot of people on already, so I wonder whether I should start. Okay, I think we should start. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Amazing to see so many people joining us tonight. We've got a few housekeeping points to note before we kick off the main event. So many people attending from all over. It's brilliant. Thanks for joining us. But there are so many people joining us that we can't possibly show everyone on screen. So as much as you can see us, we can't see you, and your microphones have been muted. The event is being recorded this evening so that we can make it available to anyone that couldn't attend. We'll also be sending out a link to all our attendees post-event, and the recording will also be published within the Diabetes Digital Hub within our website for future reference, alongside all of our diabetes wellness related resources. There will no doubt be lots of questions generated by discussion between our wonderful speakers this evening. So I encourage you to drop these questions into the chat box throughout the evening. Please use the chat box, not the Q&A function. These questions will be monitored by my colleague Claire and raised throughout the session, but there will also be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the event. So hopefully most questions will get some airtime. And I think that leaves us to introduce the event at large. So without further ado, let's get on to the exciting part of the evening. We're really pleased to have you with us for tonight's webinar, From Tech to Tactics, Optimizing Your Blood Glucose Management, where we will discuss all and anything related to CGM, or to give it its full name, continuous glucose monitoring. For people living with all types of diabetes, the journey to effective management can be a daily challenge. So having the right tools at our fingertips can make a significant difference. CGM sensors have been a revolutionary step forward in more recent times, providing real-time data that empowers people to take control of their health. Today, we'll explore how this technology can transform blood glucose control, diabetes management, can drive down HbA1c levels, reduce hospital admissions for hypos, hypers, and DKA, and create other significant impacts on a national scale. We're lucky to be joined by two expert speakers this evening who need absolutely no introduction. They will share their insights and engage you in an interactive discussion, following which we'll open the floor for a concluding Q&A session. So now for the introductions. I'm Sarah Tutton, Chief Executive of the Diabetes Research and Wellness Foundation. Claire.
I'm Claire Levy, and I look after the public relations and communications and do the regular podcast for Diabetes Research and Wellness Foundation.
Ian.
Hello everybody, my name is Ian Cranston. I'm a diabetes physician based in Portsmouth, and I've been doing glucose related consultations for sadly longer than I can remember.
Thanks, Ian. And last but not least, Partha.
I am Partha. I'm a consultant in Portsmouth, working under the guidance and tutelage of my colleague Ian Cranston.
Excellent. We're really privileged to have you this evening. Thank you so much for giving your time and expertise to our webinar and to our large audience this evening. So I think we're about to hand over and start the main talk. So Partha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So the way we thought that we would do it is make it as interactive as Sarah and Claire mentioned. But I think the first thing I would do is say thank you to DRWF for setting this up. It gives an opportunity for a lot of people to ask questions, raise the issues, probably talk a lot about the challenges that we face on the ground. And ironically, as Sarah was doing the introduction, I was actually answering an email about why is this particular strip being used or being changed without me talking or being discussed with. So I'm sure it will come up. So what I'll do is I'll give a very brief overview as to where we are in the NHS with diabetes and glucose strips. I'll make it very short. And then what we thought we would do is me and Ian will do a bit of Q&A. So I will ask Ian a few questions so he can give his overview. And then you guys all come in with your questions and we'll go from there. So where are we with diabetes care in this country? Well, it's a very tricky question to answer, because the first question that whenever people say that, my first response is, well, who are you comparing yourself to? I think it's a very important question, because to be good or bad, you got to be good or bad compared to somebody. And it's probably a bit unfair to say, oh, we want to compare ourselves to countries which do not necessarily have the same wealth or the health system as us. So you look at it as much as you can to level out those parameters. And from the diabetes point of view, if you look at it, there are some good news and there are some things that may need progress, may need better. I think that's probably the best way to put it. A lot of work done by charities, people in policies, investments. So if you've got diabetes right now, then your risk of dying, normally we talk about that if you have diabetes, one of the major risks is that you have heart attacks and strokes, and that's what people sort of perish of. Now, over the last decade or so, because of the work done by lots and lots of people, including yourselves, cardiovascular issues are not the top of the tree as regards reasons of why people with diabetes perish, for want of a better word, which is good news because it's lessen the risks of that with better control of cholesterol and statins and all of that. So that's number one. Number two, our amputation rates are better compared to still middling. It could be better. I think we've got countries which do better than us, and I think, but it's improved over the course of time. Then if you look at, for example, let's divide it up right now into, for example, type 1 and type 2 at this juncture. Type 1 diabetes, things have improved because of the explosion of technology in that group. Type 2 diabetes, the technology input has been slower, but it's picking up, just for the record. So those people on insulin with type 2 diabetes, the number right now, 60% of the population are on it. The problem is it varies. So depending on where you are, it could be 80% of the people could be on it. In some areas, it's 25. Now, that's the vagary of the NHS, which people have been trying to crack for decades as to, there is no reasonable explanation why your care should be any different if you're in Derby compared to Ipswich, or, I don't know, Portsmouth compared to wherever. But it is. And I think in my experience, a lot of it is down to clinical leadership, the push of local champions, including those living with diabetes. So that's the variable factor that we have in play. It does say NHS, but N doesn't quite always stand for national, unfortunately, the diabetes side of things. So care of children with type 1 diabetes has really, really progressed. No question about it. I think pregnancy outcomes have improved as well. Then you go into type 2 diabetes, and I think a lot more could be done when it comes to newer drugs. I think we'll talk obviously about testing today, but there are so many newer drugs come through, which is not just about your diabetes, it's about reducing your end organ damage, the things that people are worried about. And I have this conversation, which I always have whenever somebody comes to me in clinic, type 1 or type 2. I always say, what are we trying to do? And if they're of a certain age, we say, like, hey, listen, add on 20. What are we trying to avoid? It's to make sure you don't have a kidney problem or a foot problem or a, the eye problem. That's what people are worried about. And if you're a woman of a childbearing age, you think about having a healthy baby. Those are the big parameters in play. So I would probably say if you had to give the NHS diabetes a score, I know lots of our personal views, and I always see that. So, for example, I do a lot of social media. So the people who have got a closed loop, for example, hybrid closed loop on a CGM, think I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And the people who haven't got it think that I need to do much better than what I'm doing. But that's how it is, right? And, if you go into a group full of parents, they feel that I should be knighted tomorrow. And if you go into a group of older age group who still haven't got access to all the technology they should have, they feel like I should move on and give it to somebody else. And as I said, that's fine, because that's how people will view it from their own perspective, quite rightly too, because it is the lack of funding and the lack of staff which makes us go slower in that regard. So I think I would say that if you had to score out of 10, I would probably give the NHS diabetes care probably a 6.5 or a 7. I think it certainly has room to improve. But yeah, that's my overview before we sort of move into the glucose monitoring. So when you go to glucose monitoring side, I'll give you my personal perspective. Should more people have access to continuous glucose monitors? It's a no-brainer. If money wasn't a cost, I don't think we'd be having this discussion, if I'm honest. We'll talk about evidence, we talk about money. But if you take a step back, the way I do clinical care, I always have a question, which is, if my most loved one, whoever it is, and anybody in this chat can think about it. Could be your mom, your dad, your son, your daughter, your husband, wife, even your mother-in-law, if you're so inclined. And if they have diabetes, the question you have, would I want them to prick their fingers, or would I want them to have a device that gives them the glucose all the time? And I think in our mind, you go like, well, of course, I don't want them to prick their fingers because they're my loved one. Which probably sort of answers that question, that should it be for, so should I give it to everybody in front of me? And that's where the other things come in. Can the NHS afford it? So those things come in because cost is an issue. If they were the same cost as a glucose strip, then we wouldn't be having this debate, everybody would be getting it. That's the reality of where we are in the world and everything else. So, but we are at a juncture whereby not everybody has access to it, certain groups do. We'll talk about it. So as things stand, and we'll talk about it, I'm just going to bring in Ian in 1 minute, is type 1 diabetes. Everybody's eligible for it. Do everybody get it? Nope. if you look at the data, it's fantastic uptake, but it then slides off after the age of 70. Now, that could be many reasons. Could be because the NHS is a bit ageist. It could be because people go like, can you be type 1 at that age? Is it possible? Or maybe you're not. It could be because a lot of that generation don't want technology. They find very uncomfortable. Everybody have smartphones. So many reasons behind, but no question, it slides off after the age of 70. So if you look at the age, just to give you an idea, if you look at below the age of 50, the uptake is high 90s. It's amazing, some of the globally best. And then when you move past the age of 70, it slides down to about 50%, 60%. So you can see many reasons for it, but that's how it is. So that's type 1. And in type 2, as regards NICE, who say that is it cost effective, it's for people who use insulin. Generally, it's multiple shots of insulin, so it will become that. In those groups, as I said, 60% of people are on it across the board, but huge variations across areas. And the rest of the population is then leaves them with glucose strips, which sounds a bit unfair on the face of it after what I've just said, but that's the rule set as by the NHS. And then you have the final bit, and this is where I suppose we will have the conversation, is that there are some groups, NICE says you shouldn't have glucose strips at all. So, you've got, which is a bit ironic because then you go to a training program, they say, you should prick your fingers and check your glucose. And you go, but the NHS says you shouldn't have it. What do you want me to do? And given that it's NHS programs itself, it's very confusing. So those are the dichotomies we have in the system. You go to an education program about trying to prevent type 2 diabetes or, early type 2, and you learn everything and they talk about checking your glucose. And then they say, well, you can't have the glucose strips though. So that's a problem. And I think that's where I think our science needs to evolve much quicker. And I think that needs to be reviewed in my book. So that's where we are, the present situation in the NHS. And I'll just finish with this. I think it's also about context, right? So some of you will know I've taken on a role with the India government. And one of the big things we do is getting strips to anybody with living with insulin. So most type 1 diabetes people don't even have strips. So a slightly different planet and world as we go along. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be able to do it. So I think we are a rich enough country where I think we should be able to provide what's in the books and then review of the evidence to update the books, is what I would say. So I'll stop there. And with that, on that note, bring in Ian Cranston, who I've known for a long time. And without blowing too much smoke up him, I think Ian Cranston is probably in the world of technology. I think if I had diabetes, probably the one person I would go and see with eyes closed or send my loved one to, simply because he knows what he's talking about. So the way I work at the National Role, Ian knows this. I've got implicit faith in him and his belief in technology and everything. So if Ian says, nah, it's not good, then I probably wouldn't push it. So, and even if Ian says, yeah, it's definitely good, then I'll push it. So any fault you find with me is actually Ian's fault. It's got nothing to do with me. It's Ian who's actually dictated the national policy, not me. I've just implemented it, what he said. So on that note to start with, Ian, let's start with continuous glucose monitors, right? Since it's come on, there's been an explosion of it. Everybody's, is it just about the cheapest? What's the deal about it? Can we get anything? Are they all the same? I think that's the question I'll probably start with.
Yeah, so I think there's a reflective piece to start with, just on the back of what you were saying, which of course is the reason that NICE and the NHS have this policy that they do around monitoring is that they consider monitoring to be an intervention. Now, actually, if you measure blood pressure, it doesn't change your blood pressure. Actually, it probably, if anything, puts your blood pressure up when your blood pressure is measured. So I think what's important to recognize is just measuring something doesn't change it. So the issue with glucose monitoring is that whatever technology you're using to measure glucose levels, it's a case of what we do with that information that makes the difference. And so I think at some levels, that's a very straightforward decision. Blimey, that's really low, I need to do something right now. Or blimey, that's really high, I need to do something right now, is a relatively straightforward process. And I think for the most part, the difference between fingerstick monitoring and continuous monitoring is that both have the potential to be wrong. I think has to be initial statement, but the reasons that they're wrong are slightly different. So the commonest reason for having a very high fingerstick result that is wrong is because you had an orange at breakfast time and you thought you'd washed the orange juice off your finger, but you hadn't quite. And orange juice, by the way, sticks around on your finger. If it's dried onto your finger, you probably need a scrubbing brush to get it off the end of your finger, because it'll make a big difference in glucose levels. By contrast, if the CGM goes wrong, it's usually not because there's been a particular issue with that, but because there's a technical fault either with the device or with the way that the sensor is talking to the device. So there are different types of errors, but in reality, if you sort of accepting that, the accuracy of the two different technologies is actually not that different now. So when you're saying which devices should we use, is it all about price? I think what I would say is all of the devices on the market effectively use the same type of technology, which is they use actually, what I might do is I might just put the odd little slide up just as a adjunct to it. If I can find the right slide, at least I will. And how to share it, says he, not knowing. I want to share that.
While Ian is looking for it, so one of the things that we tend to do, and here is Ian, I'll bring Ian back in. One of the things we tend to do when we are asked, and I think it's quite important, is whenever something new comes in. At a national level, whenever something new, whether it's a glucose strip or it's a CGM, that's one of the pieces of work that Ian has also been involved in, is we always say, does it do what it says on the tin? That's the biggest question that we always ask. And, people come and say, it's a bit like what's happening right now with artificial intelligence. You go like, hold on 1 second. Does it actually do what you say it does? Then comes the second question, which is, that's great, but is it safe? And it's very important, I'm sure Ian will go into it, because you don't want random numbers making you change your habits. And the third one is price. So in spite of what people think, it's not, we don't just go for the cheapest price. And that's also the reason why, for example, in the technology market of type 1 diabetes, not all CGMs, not all pumps are licensed, etc. So it's just sort of important that the quality and the safety continues to be top of the tree going forwards. Sorry, back to you, Ian.
Yeah, no, so all I was going to say is that the recognition, of course, is that the CGM devices are measuring glucose levels from a little sensor, usually less than a centimetre long, that is basically like a little nylon filament that is just placed under the skin. So the first thing to say is it's not measuring blood glucose. It's measuring the glucose level in a fluid called interstitial fluid. That's the sort of stuff, if you manage to graze yourself and it doesn't bleed, but you get that sort of serous-y fluid coming out, it's that fluid that it's measuring it in. And the next thing to say is, of course, that the glucose level in that fluid isn't exactly the same as the glucose level in the blood, but that a fudge factor is applied so that it is reported in the same scale as blood glucose. That signal can be, when you do put blood on a finger stick, the reaction that's going on in the sensor effectively is the same reaction. The fluid on the sensor is completing an electric current, and the flow of current is then dependent on how much glucose there is in the liquid. The difference between putting a sensor in interstitial fluid and having blood onto a strip is that blood clots, so that after the blood has done the initial process, the sensor then becomes inactivated in the strip because the blood has clotted onto it, whereas interstitial fluid doesn't clot, and therefore new interstitial fluid flows past this sensor all the time, so a new and different current is being generated continuously, which is why we're able to get different values at 1 minute, 5 minute, 10-minute intervals, or whatever the particular device you're looking at does. So in principle, the accuracy of these devices is likely to end up being very similar to the accuracy of fingerstick devices, because the basic technology is the same technology. The difference, of course, is that then from the sensor, it's transmitted to a receiver, which most commonly is a mobile phone. And if I was making a general statement, I would say the majority of problems people now have with their CGM relates to the way they're using their mobile phone rather than to the sensor itself. Because of course we use our mobile phones for lots of things, not exclusively checking glucose levels. And so what we then do is we say, all right, what are we going to do? And the mobile phone, of course, stores it in a cloud sense, because the mobile phone is pretty much continuously connected to the internet, which is what then allows this idea of stored data and looking at it over time, because then computer systems online can aggregate data over a period of time so that you can get an overview of change over time and what's happening. So in reality, are all the systems the same? Root technology, yes. At effectiveness and evidence for their use, no. So we tend to use a number of measures to determine how accurate a sensor is. The difficulty being that the accuracy of any sensor will effectively be impacted by the person in whom it's being worn. So for example, if you looked at a sensor in somebody and how accurate it is in somebody who doesn't have diabetes because their sugars don't change very much, it would look incredibly accurate. Whereas if you look at a sensor with somebody whose sugar levels literally go between 2 and 20 all day, every day, it would make it look like the sensor was less accurate because there's far more variability in the results that are seen. So broadly speaking, most of the sensors that we would routinely approve for use within clinical settings nowadays are around about the 8 to 9% error rate. So in other words, if it says your glucose level is 6, it's probably somewhere between 5.2 and 6.8, that sort of level, which actually is very comparable to what fingerstick measures would record as nowadays. Not all of the systems that are coming onto the market, and I think there are going to be a huge number of systems potentially coming onto the market over the course of the next year or two, many of which will be coming from Southeast Asia, China, etc. Not all of these have been terribly well tested because sadly the requirements for testing technology are not the same as the requirements for testing drugs. If you test a drug, you have to show A, that it's safe, B, that it does what it says on the tin, and C, that it's better than what's already available in the market for that particular indication. When you test technology, what the MRHA requires, saying this is a washing machine that washes things, does it wash things? And that's basically the level at which you have to prove it. So having an MRHA approval for a glucose sensor, yes, it appears to be a sensor that measures glucose, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how accurate it is and how good it is. And certainly what we've tended to therefore do in the UK, is to look at the sensors alongside which we have not just some evidence about the testing in or their use in real world life, as it were, but actually with outcome data from that. So we can see, yes, not only has the person using it thought it was a good thing, but it's helped them to reduce their hemoglobin A1C, or it's helped them to reduce their risk of being admitted to hospital, or it's helped them to reduce their risk or their frequency of having hypoglycemic episodes, for example. So most of the ones that we recommend have those characteristics. And what I would say is that the ones that you're looking at on the right-hand side of this slide largely fulfill those criteria. So there are 3 main manufacturers of sensors which are routinely used in the UK currently, which is the Abbott Libre system, which currently it would either be the Libre 2 Plus or the Libre 3. The Dexcom system, which would currently be either the Dexcom 1 Plus or probably now the Dexcom G7 for most people. The Medtronic systems, which would either be the Enlight sensor or the Simplera sensor. And those are really the ones that we would tend to routinely use. However, if you look online and just put in glucose sensors, you will find pretty much immediately at least 20 manufacturers, all of whom say they're about to bring it into the UK market. Does that mean we should do a race to the bottom? Personally, I think the answer is no, for the same reason that I think many will have an experience about being asked to use a glucose meter that, from a fingerstick perspective, that they didn't find particularly helpful. An individual strip that doesn't cost very much is only useful if A, it's accurate, and B, you don't need to use 4 of the strips to actually get a result, for example. And I think there's a parallel to that with CGM. So I think we're looking for devices where there is a clinical outcome evidence base that before they're likely to be recommended anyway through clinical teams within the NHS. But of course, that said, these devices are all purchasable from chemists. So actually, if you wish to go and try a different device, you're very welcome to do so for yourself, but you would need to then buy it from a chemist.
Can I
Sorry about that, Claire, you go first.
just a couple of comments and a question. So Fiona saying, sorry, no, I'm going to go back to the top one. Rachel saying that she loves her CGM and shares, of course, her data with family and friends. Very fortunate to work somewhere that's supportive, have a champion. So many hands make light work. So she's very happy with that. Fiona's saying type 2 newly diagnosed, don't qualify for CGM, so self-funded, exactly what Ian's saying. Found it very useful to see what increases my glucose levels. Found it a stressful job. It's just as great on my reading as high carb food. It has to be really helpful to know what to do to manage diabetes, and changed jobs to reduce the impact of stress. And CGM should, in my opinion, exactly what you were saying, Partha, available a few times, if not continuously, of type 2 to see what affects us, know what's more impactful. And Richard's, actually, I will hold my hand up here. This is my brother. He's come on tonight because his wife's got pancreatic cancer. Her glucose level's been okay so far, apart from the recent few days when she's been on high dose steroids. Was prescribed fast-acting insulin. Is expected that steroids are reduced and withdrawn, the glucose levels will reduce. However, if this doesn't occur, would you recommend a CGM? Oh, another one. Gemma's asking, how are in-use times set? Are these not approved by the regulators? For example, 10 days wear for Dexcom CGM in different patient populations. I'm particularly interested in this. My son, 5, never gets to the end, and we have to continually report to the manufacturer.
So did you say brother or brother-in-law, Claire?
It's my brother.
You say your brother. So realistically, if she's acutely unwell with hypoglycemia requiring insulin, she's actually eligible now for the use of CGM.
Okay.
And actually, you could argue, if you're planning to reduce the insulin doses, but to avoid hypoglycemia during steroid reduction, how will you do that unless you know what's going on with the glucose levels accurately? So I think that's a now issue. From a longer term point of view, I would say, so realistically, it then depends. We know, sadly, that pancreatic cancer can have an impact, obviously, on the ability to make insulin, as you might expect. And therefore, if there is an ongoing issue for the lack of making insulin, then for most people in that situation, insulin itself is going to be the solution. So requiring insulin alongside the use is going to be an indication. So yes, she's already eligible. And the issue is then, what would they be using it for? So right now they'd be using it very much for the hopefully for the reduction of insulin alongside steroid doses. And then for the future, one would say, well, it depends what happens at that stage, I would suggest.
Okay.
In terms of the regulators and how long, effectively, it's a bit like saying, how long does this washing machine tablet last? If it will last for one wash, we'll call it, so the rinse aid, or what? No, that's a dishwasher, isn't it? Rinse aid. Sorry, I'm showing myself up now. I never do the washing properly. So the conditioner in your machine. So how often do I need to put conditioner in my machine? It depends how long it lasts for. So realistically, a manufacturer, to get a license, has a license both for the sensor and for how long it remains accurate. So some of the sensors started with a shorter lifespan, and then that lifespan got longer because as they got more evidence that it actually stays accurate for longer. The challenge, of course, with the longer sensor wear is actually keeping the sensor on to wear it that long. And actually, for most people, that's the biggest challenge, not pure sensor decline, but it's actually the difficulty is keeping it on, particularly if I think the comment was about a youngster, wasn't it? And I think particularly for keeping sensors on youngsters for a long period of time can be challenging to make them last for 10 days. But yeah, in theory, the sensor will last that long as it doesn't get knocked, tugged, pulled, bashed, soaked, whatever that might.
I know people stick tape on it, don't they?
Yeah, and there's a number of theories about that. My own view is tape over the top isn't a particularly useful one because it tends to the sensors also like to breathe a little bit. So most of the sensors, when you look at them, have got a little hole in the base of them. So if you do stick tape right over the top of them, they tend to actually get condensation within the sensor as a result of that. So I'm a big favour of the so-called cohesive bandage to hold things on. So, or vet wrap, I think is the common name if you're looking for it on Amazon.
Okay. Is there any evidence that sun cream spray can interfere with sensor manufacturing?
Not with manufacturing, but sensor wear, absolutely, because you put cream on,
sorry.
because you put cream on your skin and it won't stick as well, so it'll fall off. And actually, the one thing that appears to be not the case in any of these sensor packs at the moment is very early on, they all included an alcohol wipe. But apparently the manufacturers of alcohol wipes keep changing every 5 minutes. And the FDA particularly said, if the alcohol wipe changes in your box, you need to get a re-registration for that device. And everybody goes, oh my goodness, we can't possibly do that. So they just stop putting alcohol wipes in. But the alcohol wipe is a really important part of the putting it on, not for cleanliness, but to get rid of dead skin cells, because we shed dead skin cells all the time. And putting an alcohol wipe, rubbing it with alcohol, gets rid of the dead skin cells, so you're sticking it to something where it's likely to stay stuck for the period of wear of the sensor. So I think actually alcohol wipes as well will be helpful if you're putting creams on. But actually, realistically, if you put any form of cream on within really the 48 hours before wear, you're risking that it won't stick as well as you'd expect it to. Creams shouldn't have an impact upon the actual measurement of glucose levels, because obviously the measurement of glucose level is being done in the sub-skin region of the interstitial fluid. But it will certainly affect how well the thing sticks and therefore how long it works for.
I think one of the things is also to mention that I regard the regulators, if you're having consistent problem with particular sensors or a company, there is now a system set up by the MHRA, which is a regulatory body. So if you have got enough complaints about X or Y, then the regulatory body can raise that with the company concerned. So we encourage people to think about it, because to the question, that's the way we can raise the queries with the company's concern and ask them to do the relevant. So for example, adhesive were a problem. So we'll consistently raise it, well, it's falling off, what's going on? We've got too many complaints. So that really helps. So it's a yellow card system of an organization called MHRA. So hence it's Medicine Health Regulatory Body. So have a look at it, and it's worthwhile submitting to it if it's a consistent problem for yourselves. So a question then in that case for Ian, to continue the trend of what we talked about, is something else, is that, I think we've covered most of the questions we were going to, but do you feel that people have all the tools at their disposal to interpret the results? Because they're numbers and they're patterns. So do you think we as the NHS could do better, or is there access to better educational tools? How do you interpret numbers and stuff like that?
I think the interpreting numbers piece is probably the single most important element. As I say, measurement on its own isn't what changes things. It will sometimes be. So I think, to use the example of the person who was talking about it with a relatively new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and the impact upon diet. For example, knowing, oh yes, there's obvious things they can say, oh look, I had a donut and it went up, and that's a fairly obvious relationship, which is probably the donut isn't the best treatment, best food that you could possibly imagine. But equally, you might say, well, actually, I'm having a fairly average meal and the sugar levels seem to go up really quickly and take a little while to come down. Is there anything I can do to change that? And actually, depending on your own background treatment, there are things that you can do to change that. So ironically, the order in which you eat your meal has a difference to the glucose effect of the meal. So if you're somebody who starts your meal with the carby element, your sugars go up much more quickly than if you start with the meaty or fatty element. So if you're a meat and 2 veg person, then if you start with the meat and then you have your potato and your whatever after that, actually that will have less of an impact upon your sugar level with the meal than it would otherwise. So, but whereas if you're somebody who's using insulin, then it's maybe a case of about timing of the insulin and things like that. So I think the information to what to do with this information or with the glucose information is very important. And I think, again, if I can quickly do another quick slide share process, it's almost as if I'd thought about this question beforehand, isn't it? But there we go. Hopefully that's yes, I think you can see the right slide now. So I think realistically the potential benefit you can get from using a sensor, I think falls into sort of two categories, which is the potential to do something immediate. So in other words, this is an example of somebody using insulin, but say, look, it's fine now, but I can see that it's going up because I've got the up arrow next to it, and I can see the line has just been going up for the last 2 or 3 hours. So it's going to go high, isn't it? What can I do? And that's a straightforward, oh, maybe I need to think about a corrective insulin or something, or I can see it's 4 and falling and I really don't want to have another hypo sort of thing. I need to have something now, and I need to have some short-acting carb. And obviously the sorts of things you treat a hypo with become very obvious what works quite well when you're looking at CGM. So I'm a great fan of jelly babies in this respect. So the 3 jelly baby approach is really a very rapid way of stopping a fall without it then bouncing up too high afterwards. And of course, the other immediate thing you can do is you can use the alarms. And I think the alarms are an important feature, which are surprisingly regularly not set for these things. And say, well, actually, what am I worried about? If there are levels that I'm worried about, why don't I give myself a warning? Because I know if I knew my sugar level was, for the sake of example, 15, I know I would do something about that. I would have a little dose of insulin. So, well, give yourself a warning then, so you always know when it's gone to that level. And that sort of thing. So I think those immediate things are what I would tend to think of as the first aid things. And actually, although there are elements that go into how one does appropriate first aid responses for oneself, most of those are actually things that people can learn for themselves very quickly. But the other part of it is actually, and the bit we often talk about and where we get tied up with NICE and things like that, and do they approve things, is to do with and does it create a long-term benefit? Because actually, if you use a CGM to avoid a blood sugar, I'll put my alarm on if it's going to hit 20 because I really hate 20. It doesn't stop it getting to 19. So that won't necessarily help the average to come down. And that long-term average, and remember that tends to be measured by this thing called the hemoglobin A1C, which is actually it's an indirect measurement of an average relating to the blood cells in some way. But which actually takes its effect over about 2 to 3 months. The last week won't necessarily help you to achieve that 2 to 3 month process, but actually the software platforms allow you to see what's going on over time. And so, for instance, it's probably rather small to see on people's screen, but for example, for this person, they're spending the whole night rather higher than they want to. It comes down when they give their insulin in the morning, but then by the time they go to bed again. So there's clearly a structure for change, which is to say, if I keep doing what I'm doing now, I'm never going to get out of that pattern. I need to do something different. And so if you like, there's the reactive and the proactive bit, the planning ahead piece that I think is important. And I think that planning ahead piece is most commonly done during some form of face-to-face consultation. But doesn't have to be. I mean, I'm a great believer in people looking at their own data online, but looking at those aggregate data, the so-called AGP reports that are pretty much on all of these systems, saying, okay, I'm looking at that. Do I like it? If I like it, I won't change anything because I would expect the next 2 weeks to be the same as the last 2. If, however, I'm a bit worried about what's happening at tea time or what's happening at bedtime, what I need is a plan. What will I do differently for the next 2 weeks? Because if I do that again and look again in 2 weeks, if I've done something differently, maybe I can impact upon that. And I think it's that process of continuous change, but not just thinking about the last 4 hours and the next 4 hours, which is what you tend to get just looking at the phone screen, but taking that step back and saying, this is what I have been getting. I'm working hard to correct the fact that my sugars after my tea always go high. Wouldn't it be nice if my sugars after tea didn't always go high? So what could I do differently to stop my sugars at tea time going up? And it's that proactive bit that I think that a lot of the education piece needs to be offered about. And I think that's as true for people not using insulin as it is for people using insulin, in honesty.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So, which brings me to a question, a couple of them which has come up, but I'm going to pick one which sort of aligns with one thing that's come up, which is diet. And do you think we, again, with the knowledge that we have, because diets are very different, isn't it? Whether you're having a more protein-based meal, the release of glucose, because just to give an idea, and this is just a case which I'll bring in, the knowledge about diet and what low carb, no carb food does, because it still converts into glucose, but later by the liver, etc. So the question is that where you think we don't use dietetic support or help as much as we should do, just to give people understanding of the type of meal? Because I don't say to anybody you shouldn't try this diet, because my view is try a diet. If you can carry on with it and sustain it and you can tolerate it, please carry on. My job is to advise you what the effect of the sugars would be, so you're aware of what interventions to make when it goes up or down or whatever. So in your experience, Ian, do you think dietitians are underused when it comes to mapping it with glucose levels, whatever, whether using finger prick or whether using CGM? Any views on that one?
I think they probably are underused because we tend to do a lot of signposting to common and generic solutions currently.
Yeah.
In reality, all of us have a different diet. And I think when we're talking about diets, I'm absolutely I would always suggest we're getting away from the idea of this is something I can do for a month, or this is something I can do for 3 months or 6 months. This is my diet, full stop, forever. You know, diabetes, we call it a chronic disease because we cannot cure it as such. Yes, really aggressive dietary and lifestyle intervention very early in type 2 diabetes can put diabetes into remission, but we cannot cure diabetes. So I think that's a really important, which is whatever we're talking about from a foods perspective needs to be sustainable in 2 terms. One is, can we sustain a diet of 100 calories a day? No, you will die if you eat a diet of 100 calories a day, because that's not enough energy for to sustain your body. But so the issue is to say, could you have it 100 calories a day for a week? Yes, you'd feel horrible, I suspect, but you could probably get away with it. And certainly some of the intermittent fasting processes do talk about having very long periods nowadays with almost no intake other than fluids, to be honest. But so I think that the key is what you can sustain and which is realistic from a long-term perspective is what's important. And I think that individualized process realistically is exactly what dietitians could and should be able to do. But in order to be able to help people with that, they need to have a very realistic conversation with the individual. So a really useful dietetic input is not the I'm really worried about my weight, what can I do about my weight discussion. It's this is what I'm eating currently. I've got these goals. What could I be doing differently? What foodstuffs could I substitute? What processes could, because I think that's where the real benefits come in from the individualized pieces. And actually that can often be fairly quick, but I don't think that necessarily the generic I think some of the information within generic processes is right, which is it needs to be sustainable, it needs to be long-term, it needs to be not associated with likely to give you mineral and vitamin deficiencies and other things like that. But I think it needs to be individualized for you as a person. And I think that well-trained dietitians are much more likely to be able to do that. And there has been a sort of dumbing down slightly in the last few years around dietetics, which is dietetic information is being offered by a wide range of individuals, not all of whom have the appropriate background knowledge to offer it. Would be my own view.
I think there's a question here from Michelle. She's saying, as a type 1 for 33 years, timing of insulin was always an issue. So yes, the CGM has massively helped. Also, not to overcorrect, as the liver always throws a little glucose out. She's saying, I'm a keto girl now and rarely have to bolus. I've even decreased background as well to keep a check on ketones, as I've also lost 2 stone in the last 18 months.
So I think the keto discussion is exactly that, a discussion. So what we know statistically, if you take the population as a whole, around about 1 person in 5 can tolerate a keto style diet, i.e. a diet that makes you ketotic. However, there are risks to that in type 1 diabetes, because there's the issue around I'm deliberately making myself ketotic. So how do I know if these ketones relate to my carb intake or the fact that I haven't had enough insulin on board? And so I think that we know that the risks of ketoacidosis in people who do keto diets do ramp up slightly under that circumstance. And so we need to be careful from that point of view. So it's rare, in my opinion, that you will get an NHS doctor recommending a diet that is lower than about 80 grams of carbohydrate a day for somebody with type 1 diabetes because of the insulin deficiency. Although actually that type of dieting for people with type 2 diabetes is not an uncommon piece of advice at all. The challenge, of course, is we don't know who the 1 in 5 people that can tolerate it is. So giving advice to 100 people, 80 of whom will come back and tell you that was horrible advice and I hated every minute of it, and 20 of whom will say that worked quite nicely for me, thanks very much, is not the kind of advice that we usually enjoy giving, because we like to get a slightly better hit rate than 1 in 5 for our clinical advice.
So can I ask Ian, just going to the other end of it, we talked about that. What's the view on data fatigue that we talk about? Is too much? So does the world of CGM actually open up mental health issues as well? I see that, and a fair number of people who just say, you know what, I just want a break, because it feels like it's on me all the time. This time in range, where am I? Up, down, left, right, center. And I have often said to people, just take a bit of a break, because it's on the verge of breaking. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely and potentially an issue. And actually, one of the real eye-openers we've seen in type 1 diabetes around the use of hybrid closed loops is it allows people to take their eye off the data for a bit, because they say, actually, the devices will alarm at me if there's a problem, and if they're not alarming, then it's probably okay, and as long as I remember to tell it I'm having a meal and roughly how much I think is in the meal, then it will take care of it. I think there is how we use data, particularly for people not using insulin. I think there is certainly room for review of, and I saw one of the questions about saying what did we think about the non-invasive wristwatch hormones. So I think that in principle, those could be fine. They are nowhere, there is nobody who's got a technology which is anywhere near as accurate as the invasive ones currently. And so the issue is to say, I think mostly, if you just said high, medium or low, and my wristwatch can tell me that, then a lot of times I think people who are using it to manipulate, for example, lifestyle and diet in type 2 diabetes might well be able to just work on that level of information without then needing to be a specific number. I think if you might be going to use the number to decide is this 3 units or 4 units of insulin that I want to inject now, then I think you have to have accuracy as part of that process, and certainly at the moment none of the non-invasive ones come close in that respect. But equally, I think that it would be perfectly reasonable to say, well, actually, if we've got an alarm setting where it says, look, all the time I'm in a comfortable range, I just don't want to hear it or see it, is that a problem? No. And of course there are lots of different, for those people that have looked at their sites on the web platforms rather than just on the phone, there's a huge number of ways in which data can be created. I think one of the lowest, what's the word I'm looking for? Lowest.
Oh, you
sorry, I meant to hit my share screen and I hit my mute button instead. My apologies, everybody. So let's see if I can hit the right screen, the right button this time. So one of the commonest presentations of data is this idea about time in range. Forget the fact that there's 4 columns here, but actually what you can say is, okay, if this was the column telling you about time in range, you say, well, actually, yeah, I'm doing pretty well because I'm getting lots of time in range. And I think that's, for some people, that's actually, particularly those not using insulin on a regular basis, saying, look, how is this doing for me? And if I'm achieving 60% time in range now, how was I doing a month ago? Was it 50 or was it 70? Because if it's 70, then I'm doing something worse. And if it was 50, then I'm doing something better. And so you can use it intermittently. The data is there from a continuous process, but you're using it intermittently. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of doing it. But it really boils down to what the individual's treatment and personal management plan is as to how one needs to look at the data to use it effectively. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So one thing I was going to say, Ian, and I think this is for everybody, is that I think it also, before I bring Claire in, because I know we are 2025, so I think it's also potentially, and this is where clinicians need to use the data they have for better conversations for people living with diabetes. So for example, and I say this to a lot of clinicians, is that if you go and ask people living with diabetes, what do you think your blood sugar should be? And you go like, what do you mean? And you go like, what do you think we have told you? What do you think the message has been after all these years? And a lot of people go like, oh, I don't know, 4 to 7 or 8. And then the next question you go like, well, how often? And everybody I've seen looks at you very strangely as if that's some sort of trick question, because they go like, all the time? And I think when you say, well, 4 to 700% of the time is actually non-achievable for even people without diabetes. Forget about yourself. And I think it's that conversation where you go like, hey, listen, time in range 4 to 10, this is what we're trying to get to. It's still not all the time because it's such a difficult thing to get on top of. I think are better conversation places rather than telling people, oh my God, your number should have been better, because we just didn't have an idea before CGMs came along. And I think that's good, I think, for science and good for consultations, which have got a bit more empathy about, look, I don't have diabetes type 1 or type 2 or type 3C, and hey, listen, this is what we're trying to get you to. And I always have said this jocularly that, I think if you say to people 50%, you're doing okay, need a bit more work, 60% very good, 70% amazing, 80% you don't need to come and see me really. But I think the conversation then is very different, because you're encouraging people that even at the high end where you're doing amazing, listen, 30% of the time it could be out. That's just the nature of the beast as you're going along. So I think these are better conversation starters. They're better about, individualized care. And, Diane mentions that, CGM data, it has to be different because people's lifestyle is different, people's work pressure is different. And then if you've got diabetes, there are so many other factors which you can't control. The weather, the time of the month in women, all of that. So I think that's a good thing. I think this data side of things is a good thing, that you can actually have those conversations and tell people, come back next time and we'll go another 5% higher or lower. So, and I always say this to trainees, very importantly, even if somebody comes with a CG or a time in range of 10%, the answer is it's not bad. Okay, it's 10. Let's get it to 15 next time. Let's see what we do to 15. I think these are very important conversations because we don't live other people's lives, so to speak. Right, I'm going to bring in Claire at this point of time, 8:30. So yeah.
So we go back to some of the things we talked about earlier. Just things about protective covers. Just a recommendation from Sarah Taylor was Kovac protective cover. It protects the sensor and then tape over it. Dexcom ONE Plus comes with a cover. The question was about sun cream affecting the sensor malfunctioning. Dave managed to get onto a sensor and then started on Mounjaro. He's saying he admits he was quite poorly controlled, but he said he's confident had he had the technology a few years ago, he'd have been a lot better. Rachel asks, why is there a 1 hour setup time for the CGM?
So that's fairly easy, which is if you think about when you put the blood on a finger stick, it wets the finger stick straight away. When you put the sensor under the skin, there's a lot less interstitial fluid than there is blood by comparison with what you're putting on the end of a strip. The sensor needs to be properly wetted, which is, I believe, the technical term they use, before it can rely on that. So remember, the glucose value that it's reporting is basically a value that is proportional to the current that the sensor is, the electrical current that is being driven through the sensor. If the circuit isn't reliably completed by the fluid there, then the current won't be reliable either. So that first hour is basically, it might be slightly longer than is required, and certainly some of the most recent generation of sensors have managed to cut that down to half an hour. But I think even in those, what you'd say is that hour is held open because of inaccuracy during that hour, would otherwise be the case. And actually what most people who've used it for any length of time will also be able to identify is that actually the first 10 to 12 hours of any sensor is likely to be the least accurate of that sensor wear. In particular, it tends to run and register a little bit lower than it will do at other times during the sensor during that first 12 hours.
Okay. How common is the sensitivity to the adhesives? We talked about it earlier.
So yeah, around about 3% of the population respond to pretty much any adhesive that's out there. Now, we're in an unusual situation currently because there is one adhesive manufacturer worldwide who is making the adhesive for almost all sensors and all patches for pump consumables, which is 3M. So actually, although the devices are often made by different people, the tape, so the glue that's on the tape nowadays is almost always 3M glue if you manage to get far enough down the sort of manufacturing chain. So actually, so when Libre and Dexcom first came out, they were using different adhesives, so that we had a period, if someone was allergic to one, they could try the other, and they would generally find that hopefully there wasn't an overlap between there. You know, there are some people who are reactive to almost anything on their skin, so unfortunately we don't have an easy solution for them. But for most people who are reacting to one, they could try the other. In reality, they both now use 3M glue. So if you're reactive to one, you're more likely to be reactive to all. The slight plus on that is that the reason they all use the 3M glue, apart from the fact that 3M appear to have a monopoly on it, is that it's actually evidence-based as the one that created least reactions overall and has the best, for want of a better word, stick power. So no one actually is currently able to compete with the output of 3M from the point of view of the effectiveness of the glue, but it does mean that there are some people who will sadly probably be reactive to most, and under those circumstances we end up often trying to do some very long-winded approaches to use a sensor, which in terms of undertapes and things like that, which are very difficult and often rather problematic in use, in honesty.
Simplera earlier, Danielle says, apparently I cannot get these. Is there a supply problem?
So Simplera is the recent Medtronic sensor. So most people won't be accessing those themselves. So I'm assuming Michelle is saying that she isn't able to get them through her pump supply chain, which will usually come through a hospital, or actually normally through a hospital procurement process. Aware that there have been any obvious supply difficulties. Does that mean that it's the chain or otherwise? I don't know. I don't think there's been any Simplera problems at our end. I know that when Medtronic were introducing Simplera, their intention was that they were going to introduce it first for children and roll it out into adults, simply because of supply amounts, that they didn't think they would be able to just literally make an on-block switch everybody from Onelite to Simplera. So it may well be that they've made a change rather earlier, and then their supply chain has broken down in terms of supply, which is, you know, something sadly we've seen quite a lot of in diabetes care, particularly around some of the drugs for type 2 diabetes over the course of the last year or two.
Edna's asking about, can I use a transmitter at the same time as my phone for a Dexcom ONE Plus? I'm always having to carry my charger as I use my phone so much, especially for pictures. I like to have backup for seeing my BM. I personally always carry my AccuCheck mobile, as I always check my bloods before driving. If I show low on CGM, I always do bloods. I find alarms not always reliable.
Yeah, so yes, you should be able to use the two together. I think there's a couple of straightforward things, as I mentioned. The things that tend to go wrong with sensors tend to be things related to the phone. So it's things like turning off or leaving the battery saving options on for your phone, because if you leave the battery saving options on, then when your home phone hits 30%, it will turn off the Bluetooth. So effectively, you've just turned off your sensor because of the battery saving processes and things like that. There are, I have to say, a lot of people, particularly those nowadays who are using their phone as the centerpiece of their loop, who actually make the decision to say, do you know what, I actually want to have a phone that I'm using for my diabetes and a phone that I'm using for making phone calls and taking pictures and playing games and all those other things we do on the phone. Simply because, of course, one of the things around medical device production is if you have a single-use medical device that is for a specific purpose, it will have been road tested to destruction for that. Is it possible for them to do that with these devices on every phone known to man? No. And at any given time, there are probably at least 10 different versions of Android out there. So realistically, the Apple environment tends to be a little bit more controlled, although I don't necessarily think that makes it any safer in the long term. So there are lots of people saying, do you know, if I have less things trying to Bluetooth connect to my phone, does that improve my Bluetooth connection to my sensor and my pump? And the answer is, for most people, yes, it does. So if you're reliant upon your technology and you do lots of other things with your phone, then yeah, I think that's a reasonable decision. But I think, I don't know, I don't have diabetes, but I think if I did, I would probably use a separate phone for it, would be my own view.
It says, given that Ian said there was a lower bar for intervention meds rather than drugs, I'm not quite sure what that means. Why is it
for technology? Yeah.
Yeah, why is it so difficult for manufacturers, particularly Omnipod, to develop an app for smartphones?
Oh, because, right, so if something goes wrong with a medical device that is called a medical device, and anything that's advising insulin is going to be a medical device, then they are liable. Device companies compared to pharma companies are much smaller setups. So if you go to the US, the average medical negligence claim or is around about $20 million. That would put most of these companies out of business. So whereas pharma companies work on a much bigger scale. So, and the reason they don't want to do that is saying, yeah, but if I put an app, so effectively, and to use your caller's view, the Omnipod handset effectively is an app running on a phone. It's running on a very specific phone that they've tested it on, and it doesn't have any other software that might interfere with it. It doesn't have any other games, etc., because everybody's phone is different. So what they're saying is, yeah, we do not believe that we can secure our company's future against litigation using a phone that might have any number of other things on it, half of which may be, you know, there was a figure actually, I found it hard to believe, but I suppose I shouldn't be. Allegedly, half of all our phones now run malware. Because so if you've got malware running on your phone, how can they possibly guarantee it's going to be safe? So that's why they're very wary of apps. They're beginning to come in, but they're very wary of them because of the fact that other things can interfere with them.
Okay. 33 years ago, I had no advice on carbs. My training started when I was given a pump 16 years ago. That's Michelle. Marietta's saying, this is ratio. So is it a good idea to take, for example, 8 units of insulin if your meal is, say, 60 grams of carbs, ratio 1 to 10, if you know that you're going to have a snack within the 3-hour period of a 60-gram carb meal?
So what I would say is there are a couple of statements out. First of all, is 1 for 10 is a starting point calculation. And it's actually a really simple calculation. It's a 1 for 10 is a calculation based upon the average weight of a person being 70 kilograms, the average requirement of insulin being between 0.5 and 0.7 units per kilogram per day, and the average requirement for the balance of that insulin being about half and half between basal and bolus. So the 1 for 10 is, given that the average carbohydrate intake in the Western world is somewhere between 200 and 250 grams a day, if you're a 70 kilogram person using 50 units of insulin, then 1 for 10 suggests that you're eating 250 grams and that your 25 units is required each day for that. It's a starting point for a calculation. It's not an absolute. I think the challenge is that many people never get beyond that initial process. I'm not a fan, I have to say, of trying to say within 3 hours I'll have another meal, therefore I'll dose for it now, because that won't work as well. And I think realistically, it's one of the reasons why we say, look, people who have lots and lots of, the so-called grazing eating often do much better on a pump than they do on MDI insulin. Making the assumption, obviously, this is someone with type 1 diabetes asking the question rather than type 2. I would recommend, unless you know it's right with it, that you would look to then bolus at the time you're having the snack or before it, rather than at some point in the next 3 hours I plan to do it, because otherwise you're sort of doing that sort of little Russian roulette thing, which is, will I go hypo before I snack or not?
Do you know, so somebody had an issue, Marie, with a Dexcom 5 weeks ago. Once inserted, didn't register, on removal, no filament evident. Monitor returned to Dexcom for review. However, I now have an ulcerating lesion. I'm on long-term antibiotics while awaiting an ultrasound scan. Retained filament. Anyone else had this issue?
So I've seen a couple of people with a similar, there didn't appear to be a filament. Actually, for both of those people, because I was possibly, I don't think it should be physically possible for the filament to get flung in and left in. What actually happened in both of the ones which I saw is that as the needle came out, it pulled the filament with it, and the filament was actually coiled. So rather than being able to see a filament on the outside, the filament was actually coiled on the inner part of the sensor. So I think there may have been a batch, because I've heard of several people, there may have been a batch where there was a fault, but I doubt that it's a retained filament, simply because they're very superficial. And so you'll know yourself, if you get a splinter will tend to work its own way out. So it won't stay there. And as I say, all of the ones that I've seen, actually, what's happened is that the filament's been dislodged as the needle has been removed with the insertion, and it's pulled the filament back into the gubbins of the actual sensor block, the transmitter block. But I don't know. I mean, yes, clearly it's I guess it's theoretically possible. I think it's more likely that it's just the trauma of that extra pull that's given you the infection, sadly.
Somebody asking about remission reversed on type 2. Is there a way I can come off medication?
Yeah. Can I ask something, because I need to dip out soon? Did you had some couple of questions which we were talking about, because I know they came in earlier. Did you want me to quickly take those?
Very early on.
When we were talking about, before we started, we talked about questions that come in.
Sure. I think you wanted to cover the new 10-year health plan sets out its intention to create a new model of care. How do you think this will play out for people with diabetes in the near future?
So I think one of the things, I was looking at a lot of the questions, and I think we need to be sort of, individual cases. We need to be careful as how much advice we can give, because of not being fully aware of the patient and the person concerned. I think as regards the 10-year plan, there are bits there, and I think a lot of it will depend on the present leadership and how they sort of use that opportunity, because there are the main three things are things which do appeal to a chronic disease setting. Prevention is number one. Converting analog to digital, we were talking about all of that today. How do you use modern technology? And finally, moving more care in the community where diabetes already is, if I'm honest. So I think the opportunities are huge, especially if people tackle if you think of the lots of the things we have talked about today, how to use the technology, which is all about preventing complications or preventing you developing type 2 diabetes or putting into remission so complications don't happen, a lot of the focus could be there. So I think there are the opportunities there in the 10-year plan. Now, I think the thing with always these things are you've got battling against competing interests in one pot of money. So I think that's where the clinical leadership sits as to what they can deliver going forward. It should be revealed in the next few months, one hopes so, as to where the diabetes priorities will sit going forward. So I think wait and watch on that one, I would say. But the opportunities are certainly there. And which is probably also explains why so much focus has been on use of, for example, hybrid closed loops in children with type 1 diabetes or women trying for pregnancy, because it's all about prevention from that sort of complications from that perspective. So the markers are there. It's a question of whether they can hook onto it and make it happen.
The devil is in the detail.
Always, as ever, as we all know very well.
Arthur, before we carry on, you have to leave us now. So can I just thank you so much for your contribution this evening? I'm sure everyone appreciates the time that you've given us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for asking. Thank you for the work you're all doing. So thank you very much. Take care. Bye.
Take care, Arthur.
Bye. Bye.
So Ian, I think you are able and willing to stay on for a little longer. We're due to finish at 9. I think we've still got a few questions to get through if we can. So shall we carry on?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Just talk about disposal and recycling for Libre. I think people don't realise they've got a battery in them. Well, I think they've all. Yeah, you're not meant to put them in the general waste, are you? Put them in your shops, I was told.
I think a number of the manufacturers have been talking about trying to produce, you know, keep them in pots, and obviously the insertion piece that requires that pulls the needle out isn't recyclable because it's got a needle that's potentially contaminated in it, so that bit isn't recyclable. But the sensor itself potentially has things that are recyclable. At the moment, I'm unaware of anybody who is actually successfully managing to do any recycling, and actually mainly the focus by manufacturers has been on trying to minimize the size of the external packaging, etc., from that point of view. And so certainly those people that have seen the Libre 3 will know that there's a lot less plastic and other tissues within it that compared to the Libre 2. And a lot similar to obviously the Dexcom G7 and the Dexcom ONE Plus compared to their previous generation, where there was a lot more wastage there. I think there is always a challenge with recycling for things that potentially have got blood and tissue fluid contamination, frankly.
Some people talking about using CGM as a competitive tool. So you're trying to keep your 97%.
Yeah, so I think I don't so gamification of health is a research topic all of its own for lots of different conditions, and I think I'm certainly not against being competitive with CGM data as long as we're being appropriately competitive, because remember, the goal is not just about time in range. It's about minimizing time below range. So I think that any competition, if you were creating like the equivalent of your squash league table or whatever, you would say the only people who can be in this league table are the people that have no time below. If you have a 0% below, then yes, you can be as competitive as you like on the time in. But the challenge is, I think, people who generally push very hard at keeping the time in. I've seen people who will literally say, look, I've got 85% in range, but the other 15% are below range. That's a high risk profile. That is not a good outcome. That's a high risk profile. So it's I think gamification and competition is great for many people. Interestingly, particularly men seem to like doing that, don't they? I don't know if your questioner about that was a man, but it does appear to be men that, in my clinic anyway, that like to do this. 3 or 4 who literally will come in and ask about where am I in the league table or something. Well, I haven't got
No,
a
this was a lady actually,
Oh,
Michelle.
well, there we go then. That just goes to show that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But so I think as long as it doesn't target time in and low averages at the expense of time below and hypos, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Okay. People asking about how long data is kept.
So when you go onto any CGM device, and I don't believe there are any exceptions to this, that spiel of stuff that you agree to is basically your data is then put into the cloud. It is put into the cloud in an anonymized form with a key that is your lock into that. So in other words, when you say, I'd like to see my data, it pulls your data from the cloud so you can see it, which is exactly what happens if you've been to a clinic where people have looked at your data. If you stop offering your data is still in the cloud and will be, but it's just that it can no longer be identified as yours. So when you first sign up, those things that you're signing up to is, yes, I'm happy for my data to be stored in the cloud, and most certainly if the phone ones won't work unless you store the data in the cloud. So that data stays in the cloud, but the ability for it to be identified as anything to do with you is stopped as soon as you delete your account. The data is still there. It's there as anonymized and not yours, if that makes sense.
Okay. Do you want to touch on any trials with GLP-1s for type 1s, or is that a bigger?
That's a bigger deal, and in reality there haven't been that many. So and I think it boils down to 2 things really, which is most of the diabetes related trials for GLP-1s have been related to effect on glucose control. Now, what GLP-1s do, the variety of things, but mainly what they do is they increase insulin secretion along with a meal, which is kind of a good thing if you're able to make insulin. And they also suppress glucagon secretion. Now, neither of those things in what I will refer to as pure type 1 diabetes is a key driver of the glucose control. However, people with type 1 diabetes, in the same way as the rest of the population, are at the same risks of becoming insulin resistant as the rest of the population as our weight as a population average rises. And so what we know is that there are some people with type 1 diabetes who effectively develop what's called double diabetes. So in other words, they have many of the metabolic features of type 2 diabetes, but they also are unable to make their own insulin. Now, that often can be contributed to because of over-insulinization, in fairness, in terms of people using very high insulin doses, but it can also result in people becoming quite resistant to the effects of insulin. So clinically, people who are requiring consistently over 1 unit of insulin per kilo of body weight, and as a total maybe over 100 units of insulin a day, there have been some studies looking at, does use of GLP-1 therapies help those people improve their glucose control because they've got additional insulin resistance? And that does appear to be a group who can benefit. What hasn't been done, and to my knowledge is unlikely to be done, is the other bits of this which relate to and the reason we like GLP-1s in type 2 diabetes is because they have this major potential impact upon cardiovascular and renal risk. That is unlikely to be done in type 1 diabetes simply because of the size of the study that would be required from that point of view. So that evidence, I think, is going to be challenging to produce. And of course, the other dirtier of that water, or stirrer of that water, not dirtier, relates to the fact that, of course, the most popular use of GLP-1s currently is probably around weight management. Now, weight management in type 1 diabetes is clearly going to be tied in very closely to insulin requirements from that point of view. And so I think the use of GLP-1s for the first perspective is not licensed, and therefore most people in NHS circumstances won't offer that as a routine to people with type 1 diabetes unless there is good evidence that that person is also significantly insulin resistant. So you'll be aware that there's a huge issue currently about what GLP-1 therapies, the sort of Mounjaro, Wegovys, are around weight. And at the moment, it's not forever, but the current guidance from NHS England is that those people who are eligible for that on the NHS are people who have a BMI over 40, so that's pretty flipping big, frankly, and at least 4 comorbidities from that BMI. So that will not include the vast majority of people with diabetes, even if it had a license currently. That may change over time, or we expect it will change over time. But as there is no license within type 1 diabetes, I think that's going to be a long-term concern, frankly.
Okay, just answering a question about Sharps bins. I get mine on prescription.
Claire, can I just interrupt? Yeah. I think there might be a couple of questions that came quite early on that I'm not sure that we've covered. So one is from Rebecca, whose son has been diagnosed with Hashimoto's. Yeah. Did we do that one?
No, we haven't yet.
Okay, so struggling, was diagnosed 9 months ago, age 19, struggling with low mood, forgetful with insulin, workplace not hygienic, so injecting can be difficult. Believe a pump would help with these issues, but what chance is there of him obtaining a pump? He's got a Libre 2 Plus. Is it dependent on area you live in once you're over the age of 18?
So currently, in theory, anybody with type 1 diabetes, obviously the Hashimoto's is not related to his diabetes, that's his thyroid, but anybody with type 1 diabetes who has a average glucose control that is a higher hemoglobin A1C than 58 millimoles per mole effectively is entitled to be considered for pump therapy. Now, the implementation period for that is a 5-year total, because obviously the process of implementing CGM is much more straightforward than the process of implementing pumps and the safety elements that need to go alongside that. So if he's struggling, however, then I would say the earlier you're on the list locally, the more likely you are to get it earlier. And certainly there are, for most areas, age is a criteria. So in terms of the national prioritization is children first, pregnant women or people planning pregnancy second, and everybody else after that. So he's very close to the you know, in theory, there's a grey area where childhood finishes and adulthood begins, but basically certainly some pediatric responsibility continues up to the age of about 19. So I would have thought that he's on his age basis, he's likely to be relatively prioritized towards that. So if he has, but realistically that needs to be offered through specialty care. So if they're only seeing their GP, that's not going to happen through the GP. It needs to be happening through specialty care. And if they're seeing specialty care, if they make sure they talk about it and ask about it, that's the best way to make sure they get listed.
Okay, thank you. We're actually very close now to 9, so I think there's probably a few questions that we haven't been able to answer this evening, but we might be able to provide some sort of answer to those outstanding questions by email post event.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay, so Ian, if you're, I think we might be done for the evening. You've very kindly given us your time this evening, so absolutely. I think we need to draw to a close. It's incumbent upon me to thank our sponsors, Dexcom, Insulet and Embecta, and their support as fantastic partners of DRWF enable us to provide both in-person and online events such as this. And it goes without saying that we owe a big thanks tonight to Partha and Ian for their time and their expertise. You very generously support all of our activities and give your time voluntarily. So we've had a great evening of discussion tonight. So thank you so much. And I should thank Claire and our behind the scenes team from Complete Events, Georgina and Lisa. You can't see them, but they've been there all along with us. And finally, thanks to everyone that's joined us this evening. We've had a fantastic turnout, and your questions and your interaction with the chat feature has really made for, I think, an excellent interactive event this evening. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to everyone that's participated, and I hope you will join DRWF at a future event. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.